Sweet. All right, so here we are on Google Hangouts with extras, and we're the extras. I'm Jack, and this is Robert, and we're here to talk about some shit we think is interesting, and specifically what that is the Occupy Wall Street protests. Now, this isn't a big surprise that pretty much everyone thinks this is interesting, but so we want to tie this into some other ideas that we have about automation and things like that. And so we're just going to talk now about some stuff. How's that sound, dudes? Sound good? Oh, yeah.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Jack. I think that, yeah. So anyway, here's the deal. There's fucking people protesting by the hundreds of thousands all around the world in solidarity with each other. This is completely fucking unprecedented. What the fuck is going on? What's that?
Like, even in the history of the world, like, what do you mean, like, there's, like, protests literally, like, in every, like, developed country, like, like, at the same time about the same thing?
Yeah.
Like, what's this, like, are you serious? Like, I don't, like, I think it's one of those things where, like, there's so many things like this where it's a huge deal, but it's not necessarily clear to people exactly how huge of a deal it is.
Yeah.
You know, like, something like Facebook. Everyone knows it's a huge deal, but I play Farmville on Facebook. Like, no, but you don't get it. It's a huge deal. So what is the sense in which this Occupy Wall Street thing is really globally impressive? Like, let's try and put this in perspective.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about why these are going on. Obviously, unemployment is a really big issue right now. We're at something like 9% officially, but if you include
like
underemployment,
14% if you add marginally employed people.
Yeah, I've heard 17%, but even the people who have jobs have basically no job security, which is really shocking when you consider that we have more wealth than we've ever really had. Corporate profits are at record levels, etc.
Right.
So my explanation for this is really increasing automation, and not just automation, but increasing rate of automation. So the more technologically advanced a society gets, the faster its technology develops. It took us, however long to build the first transistor, and now we're basically doubling the amount of transistors on chips. Blah 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 blah. All the usual Kurzweilian shit. But it is true that as these scientific networks get built out, then they get more productive.
So exponential growth, but that's a hard thing for people to get a picture of, because like there's been entire millennia in human history where things didn't really change, and now we're talking about like the difference between like 2000 and 2010 being this vast differential, So it's like it's even that kind of change. Like if you're used to that rate of change, I mean it's still something that sort of takes some thinking about. Like, oh, if change really is exponential, then the change I'm experiencing now and in my lifetime as an adult is going to actually only increase at a rate that's like far greater than like what I now know. And that's a curious thing.
And that's really where I think economists they kind of have a big blind spot in their thinking generally. There are a couple of economists who get this, but as far as like the professional field goes, they're just kind of in the dark, in my opinion. The usual. Because people make these arguments quite often that technology is increasing unemployment, etc. We had the Luddites, hundreds of years ago, and similar kind of movements since then. But as I was talking about before, the rate of technological change is a lot different now. So whereas before you would automate an industry and that would displace a bunch of people, it would remove jobs from an entire industry or something like that, or what have you. But what would happen is that those people would get trained for another field. Another field would develop because, automation increases the wealth of a society overall, so people go into service industries or whatever, whereas they were manual laborers before. The problem with applying that kind of logic to what's going on now is that it's quite simply just getting easier in a lot of cases for owners of capital to build a robot that can do a task, or to design software or piggyback on somebody else's software to do these tasks faster than it is to train workers to do new jobs. So we're creating this kind of permanent underclass of people who don't have the wherewithal to make money in the current economy.
Right. Now, generally, I think people are aware that, okay, yeah, like, robots, and so on. But I think there's this thought, because knowledge proceeds so quickly, oftentimes faster than we can keep up with it. There's this thought that, like, well, robots are kind of taking over. Well, they're taking over, like, mainly manufacturing, right? And this is kind of, I think, this vestigial view that we have. But let's give 3 examples of increasing complexity and surprising, and the quality of surprise, where robots are actually taking jobs which we wouldn't think that they could take over. So one of the first cases that we've talked about is fruit picking and the fruit processing industry. Now, one critique, as you mentioned, of, for example, like the Occupy Wall Street project, is like, oh man, there are jobs like in the Southeast. There's like a lacuna, of jobs in like the agricultural industry, and it's just you guys don't want the jobs, right? So this is like a hypothetical argument. It's true that there is this like lack of sufficient workers because of the sort of racist, the xenophobic policies of the landowners in that region. But the problem with that is that there's increasingly like robots that actually do that job. And it's a lot easier to have a robot do the job than it is to have even a migrant worker, much less an American worker who has greater expectations as to the manner in which he or she is to be treated. It's easier to just have a robot to go do that. So we have robots that go in and they pick the trees. So the robots pick the trees, the fruit off the trees, and then the robots actually sort all the fruits using various kinds of sensors and da-da-da-da-da, and so the job of the picking of the fruit and the sorting of the fruit and the entire process is increasingly mechanized. Now, I don't think that, except for the people that, ultimately, who's bewailing like the lack of the fruit picking industry? I mean, it's bad for the people who had those jobs and they were greater than the jobs they could have, for example, in wherever they're from, right? So there's that, but in general, like, there's probably more productive things that anyone could do for society if that necessity is removed. So, okay, so let's say the fruit picking industry goes, right? And it's now robots, and that's that. But then you get into these, like, increasing levels of complexity. So there's the fruit picking industry, but then there's also, for example, the legal industry. Now, this is surprising. Like, we know robot checkers. We maybe will accept, like, robot, car makers. Maybe we'll accept robot fruit pickers, but, like, that's robot. I mean, like, automated legal services. So now you're more knowledgeable about that. Why don't you talk about that for a second?
Sure. So one of the more interesting developments in the legal industry of the past 5 to 7 years or so has been advances in electronic discovery. So you have all these documents that traditionally young, new lawyers would sort through because they don't really know a whole lot about how to be a good lawyer yet. So they're kind of assigned to this more menial task of sifting through boxes and boxes of documents to find something that can be used to make the case for the client. About a half a dozen years ago, people started using automated software. It's like an artificial intelligence to sift through and find relevant bits of information. And this technology is only getting better. So there's a huge glut of lawyers in the legal market right now. The recession isn't good for anybody, but most lawyers would say that it's hit their industry disproportionately. And if you look at the kinds of lawyering jobs that have been cut, it's really explicable by this mechanism. Now, what does this mean for the future, though? A lot of people think, oh, well, this is just, this is the menial labor. Robots can't actually think, so people up top are really going to be okay. That's a real big mistake. You want to say something about that?
Right. Well, yeah, that's a big mistake. All right, was that still in regards to the legal industry? Because I wanted to go into the third example of the scientists, for example.
Well, that's a good segue. So why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so going on with this idea of these three examples, we have the fruit picker, we have the legal automaton, and then we have at the highest and most recent tier, we have this idea of a robot scientist. So this goes into realms which people were previously thought to be sort of, that's our particular domain. Like, yeah, machines may do X or Y, but I'll tell you one thing they can't do. They can't come up with, like, scientific theorems. They can't develop, like, scientific formula, and so on. However, this has recently been shown to be false. A pair of scientists developed a program called Eureka, made it open source on the web, and they used it to analyze data sets. Their particular shtick was analyzing bacteria, and so they fed it a bunch of information about various things these bacteria were doing that they were studying, giant data set. And the interesting thing about this is that the program worked. It looked at the data and it provided formulae which are true of these bacterial cell walls and things like this that these students are studying. I'm just going to reiterate that. The computer program looked at the data and developed a formula that is true in regards to data set. That is to say, it has it developed a scientific theory, explanation, etc., whatever you want to call it, formula that is true, an equation. The interesting thing about this equation is that we have no idea what it means. We have no idea what it portends. It may be something about cells and biology that we actually had no idea about before. Because these scientists didn't make the program communicate with people in such a way that to provide the translation between that sort of final conclusion and the starting point. If I walk into a room and I'm like, guys, I've got it, octopuses, and you're like, what are you talking about? I can then backtrack to you and be like, well, I was thinking about cephalopods and how cool they are. And, the shape that our future overlords should have. And it's obvious that it should be, like octopus. And I can tell you what I've been thinking, which, of course, 99% of the time is actually about some kind of octopus. But, and the other 1%, I don't want to tell you about. But that's fine. Anyhow, so this program, as yet, doesn't have that capability. It will, and then we'll be able to know, what the hell these kind of gnomic, true but incomprehensible to humans as yet formulae are that it's exporting. But it's important to realize that this is something that we thought only people could do until very recently. I mean, we admire Newton above perhaps all scientists for just sitting about and thinking up these kinds of things, these kind of theoretical frameworks. And this is something where computers are starting to make an inroad. Now, I mean, it's not like the entire road, but it's an inroad, and it's something that until recently we wouldn't even have thought to potentially use.
Yeah.
So there's three examples of increasing automation that are really surprising, really strange, and may have something to do with what's happening in general society, the wealth disparity, Occupy Wall Street, and so on. So, you want to speak to that?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to emphasize something that's really impressive about this Eureka program. Not only do these formulae hold up for the data set, but when the scientists do further experimentation afterwards, they also match with that new data set. So it's not just a matter of collecting previous data. It actually makes a prediction that it is true.
Right, which fulfills one of the requirements of being fucking valid science, right? It's predictive. It's like, oh, given all cases of this is the case.
Right.